All right, good morning and welcome to PACT's MedTech Series. I'm Dean Miller, the President and CEO of PACT, and I want to welcome you this morning. We're excited for this hour-long lineup. We've got some terrific speakers and guests. I first want to just recognize, since this is a MedTech Series, all the amazing work that the frontline healthcare workers are doing out there. We're going to talk about the medical technology world, the effects of COVID, etc., but I just want to recognize some of whom may be on this phone call right now or connected to you via family, friends, neighbors, etc. Just a shout out to them. We couldn't do what we do with terrific supporters and sponsors, and I want to recognize our sponsors here this morning, led by Duane Morris. You'll hear from partner Rich Cohen shortly. EisnerAmper, RSM, the Penn Center for Innovation, and Fox Rothschild. We're going to start with a presentation on predicted medtech trends from Pedro Arboleda, Managing Director of Deloitte Consulting. We're going to have a Q&A with him, so we'll tell you how to submit your questions in just a minute here, led by Rich Cohen from Duane Morris. And then halfway through, we're going to shift gears and we're going to do a panel discussion on the medtech funding landscape and outlook for next year, moderated by Michael Harrington from Fox Rothschild. A few etiquette, and for those of you who have participated, you certainly know these by now. All attendees are muted. We're going to use the Q&A window to ask any panelists questions. You can also use the chat function to chat with other attendees or to Danielle Pinto, who is hosting this call. But again, use the Q&A window to ask panelists questions. We'll pick those up. And that's about it. Let me, without further ado, introduce Pedro Arboleda, who is Managing Director with Deloitte. Pedro's based up in Boston and is obviously part of the MedTech team at Deloitte. We're very fortunate to have Deloitte as a strong member of PACT and excited to have Pedro here this morning. Pedro, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dean, and hello to everyone. Hopefully my presentation is coming up on your screens. If you could just confirm, Dean or Richard, that'd be great. Can you see my presentation?
Yeah, we can see it.
Perfect. So thanks everyone for your time today. I'm going to spend about 15 or so minutes just going over a couple of slides just to facilitate a conversation really. And it's based on some material that Deloitte published last year around how could medtech companies envision collaborating with consumer technology companies in this race to really win and capture value in new ways, really. And I'm going to put in a wrinkle around, how this has changed, how the narrative has changed slightly because of COVID, but you'll see pretty early on that if anything, COVID has just accelerated these trends. And so we'll kind of have a chance to talk about that in the Q&A as well. As our paper and our report posits, all these changes, the innovation cycles that we see, which are, after having done this over a period of 18 months, we studied this in depth. We had 180 people contribute to this report. This future health story really is unfolding because of some underlying capabilities that you see on the left there, on the lower left, which we all are very well aware of. I'm not going to retread that. But the innovation cycles being what they are, about 7 years, we work closely with various groups at MIT and Singularity around understanding these innovation cycles. And certainly we've seen that events such as COVID only accelerate these trends, right? And just to take two examples, we've seen the rise of telehealth. Really, it was already there, it was already coming along, but fairly incrementally. We've seen an explosion of the use of telehealth and in digital virtual means of engaging patients, physicians. And this goes all the way, not just for care management, but also for the way, for example, sales teams are interacting with physicians and providers in new ways. So, certainly that's part of the acceleration. And obviously, demand for procedures has been affected, and there's now a need to rethink how to best keep tabs on patients beyond the high acuity centers, right? It used to be very normal to just have a patient come in, right? And so COVID's changed that behavior somewhat. It's people are reticent to come into to hospitals for fear of infection. And so that triggers a whole need to have a better remote diagnostic and monitoring platform to take advantage of ways that you could peer into the health of patients. So just to say that the trends that were articulated in that report, and I'll provide a link to the report at the end of the presentation to make this presentation available to everyone on the call. So no need to take too many notes, but we'll kind of go through that at the end. So in the paper, we also talk about how this research that we looked into really uncovered a number of roles and archetypes that medtech companies could and need to really take advantage of if they're going to win in this race to providing better value for for the products and services they provide. So, obviously, when you think about the marriage of medtech companies and consumer technology companies, oftentimes the reaction from my clients, and I have everything from very large medtech clients to startups, is they're somewhat wary, right? I mean, you have these very deep-pocketed consumer technology companies coming into the healthcare space, making very large plays, and oftentimes the first reaction is, I don't want to give away my IP or my know-how to these very formidable competitors. But I think that leaves a lot on the table, and the report points out various ways in which you can take advantage in a sort of co-opetition perspective, some of the capabilities that these consumer technologies companies have, and in particular around data and platforms, right? I mean, they're famous for having created platforms in the first place. These platforms are now being extended to areas that cover health, right? And so it's a natural extension. If you hear CEOs of some of these consumer technology companies talk about it, they feel like their future versions will only be talked about within the context of health. I mean, certainly in the case of Apple, you have the CEO talking about the importance of health in their future state. So, the convening of the data, the insight generation from the algorithms that are trained on those very large data sets that go beyond the therapeutic area in a lot of ways. And obviously, device companies have data themselves, but what we're positing here is that the data that you could train those algorithms on can benefit from these platforms that these companies have built, because they are extremely good at curating that data and stitching together insights that are way beyond what a medtech company would have access to. And they've really created the underlying infrastructure for that to happen. And as we know, these consumer technology companies are also incredibly good at knowing the consumer, right? And that's not been a place where medtech companies have traditionally played or been very concerned about. Medtech companies, as we know, have focused on providers and physicians as their core audience and core customer group. And so the knowledge that these consumer technologies companies have of consumers also becomes another capability that could be very, very well suited to medtech companies as they go closer and closer to the consumer, as the consumer now becomes a much more present buyer of devices and decisions that inform the purchase and use of those devices. And so you're starting to see that play itself out. Now, we went around and asked various experts, who's going to be driving this innovation as we think about medtech, consumer technology companies, and other stakeholders in the health ecosystem. And certainly you could see, at least from the group that we surveyed, there's a lot of sharing of that innovation value by medtech and consumer tech, but both on the digitally connected devices perspective, on wearable devices, diagnostic implants, but also in the aggregation and collection and insight generation that's going to be required for that data to be really brought to its fullest potential. And obviously on robotics, the device companies still have a predominant share of the value creation, at least from this expert panel. but it stands to reason that that capability can only be enhanced by collaboration with consumer technology companies. And so when you sort of then step back and think, oh, well, okay, so it seems medtech and consumer tech can get together and create lots of value and capture that value. How? On the right-hand side, we have ways, at least, that we can certainly think about that value being generated. And I mentioned remote patient monitoring, right? I mean, sort of creating the platform that allows you to aggregate signals and data from multiple sources, from the devices themselves, of course, but also marry it to complementary data sets around patients. If you have asthma, it's not just the device data from that asthma device inhaler, but also the air quality in your house, in your office, in your car, places where you spend a lot of time and that matter. And so aggregating these types of signals more comprehensively and holistically become a joint solution that could generate incredible amounts of value. You obviously have the integration of this data, the interoperability becoming less and less of a concern these days as we continue to try to slay that monster. That's become a lot more present and a lot more available if we get together as a medtech industry, if we get together with some of the consumer technology companies that are managing these data sets, and of course improving productivity on the delivery of care. Obviously, everything from virtual clinical trials to how to train clinicians on how to better use equipment and devices, that's all going to depend on creating digital twins of the operating room, creating digital twins of the lab, creating ways in which humans interact with your devices and equipment. And that could only be benefited from the capabilities, again, that the consumer technology companies have at their disposal. They've invested quite a lot of money in. Again, I'm going through this fairly quickly because I want to get to some Q&A. This just sets up this other trend that's the shift to alternative sites of care. And we all know about that. And again, COVID's only accelerated that. I think if you look on the right-hand side, you have some reasons to believe why, the shift to the home has now become front and center. That's certainly why a number of companies are investing in capabilities that allow them to deliver at least some of the care at home. Obviously, some procedures will always have to be done at the hospital in the acute setting, but for certain interactions, that's certainly the case. Home health can really do a great job, and then retail health, obviously another big growth area, 20% growth, CAGR growth there. Again, these slides are going to be provided at the end, so if you'd like to look at the data more closely, I'd be happy to do that. The large trends that we've observed around the future of health, around data sharing, we certainly see, and here we have a point of view on not just the trends themselves across the top, but how we are seeing COVID impact these trends. So data sharing has only become much more prolific. You have examples of even non-HIPAA compliant tools at least being used temporarily, Zoom, and the telehealth solutions that are being used and tested, very well received by physicians and patients alike. Stands to reason that it'll have to be HIPAA compliant again after this initial phase of the pandemic. But nevertheless, it points to this whole notion that the sharing of this data, across health systems in a particular city or region, becomes a very important component of managing and delivering care. The interoperability I mentioned before, these are trends that have been going on for a long time. CMS is behind a number of these. The regulations have become a lot more present in terms of interoperability. The reimbursement it has also become much more feasible. You could make a case that COVID's only increased that, and the portability of the records, the EHR records, diagnostic and monitoring, and the testing that goes on now in some cases remotely is only increasing that. One of the trends that we do see being somewhat affected negatively by COVID is access, right? I mean, 38 million Americans now lost their jobs. It's estimated that between 10 million or 11 million of those Americans will not be getting insured. Some of them are going to go to ACA, some of them are going to get covered by Medicaid. but some are not going to get insured, right? I mean, some are going to remain uninsured, and that's a problem. We see some issues with certain communities that have been disproportionately affected in getting access to healthcare. And so that's a concern, and that certainly will need to be addressed. And then there'll be some companies that attempt to address it and create a lot of value from that. The other trends around the empowered consumer, I mean, consumers, again, 30%, before the crisis, 30% of consumers were on high deductible plans already. Covered workers were on high deductible plans. So they were paying for the most of their healthcare during the year. That's only getting accelerated in terms of how much they're at the decision, at the table to make a decision on procedures, devices. So that I think, you know, they're much more well informed. You had an uptick in the way people looked at health as a result of COVID. So we see that trend accelerating. We see behaviors being changed, you know, things that were not thought of as being feasible or now very quickly being feasible, you know, the at-home consults, the consumers being much more hungry for information about health. Obviously, scientific breakthroughs, they're going to need their table stakes. You still need to produce amazing world-class products to make it out there in the marketplace. But you know, the approval process, at least during the pandemic, have obviously become faster. And there's things that were completely unheard of are now happening in terms of the acceleration of R&D and development efforts. But we'll see if that continues. We'll see if there's behaviors that are changed on that front as well. So these are just some trends. Happy to talk about these in the Q&A. I know we're leaving some time for that, Richard, and I'm happy to start a conversation within the context of these trends.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot. Again, I'm Rich Cohen with Duane Morris. We're, as always, happy to partner with PACT, longtime sponsors. If you have any questions, as Danielle had put in the chat, please put it in the Q&A, and we will pass them along to Pedro. I guess, Pedro, first question, starting off, just one that I have is, you know, during COVID, we've seen a lot of opportunities for our emerging business clients to partner on technologies, both consumer and med tech, with larger entities that probably or maybe would have done those things in-house in the past. And just wanted to get your take on that trend, particularly in med tech and with the big healthcare systems.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So, look, I mean, I think, you know, a lot of medtech companies, certainly the large medtech companies, have amazing data science teams, and you know, they've been at this game for a while now, right? I mean, they develop world-class products. Those products that are connected have signals and data coming from them. Those signals and data, they're being trained, and algorithms are being deployed, and AI capabilities are being deployed as well to train those algorithms, and you know, and insights are being generated all the time, right? The question now becomes, can you improve the predictive power of those algorithms, right? And can you, as a medtech company, even a small company, a startup, can you access a better insight generation engine, right? And so where do you look for that? Well, some of the best companies out there that have insight generation engines are the consumer technology companies, right? Because they've been dealing with massive data sets for a long time as well. And so you have examples of medtech companies, providers, and consumer technology companies getting together. I mean, you can sort of point to, for example, what Mayo's doing with Google. It's a public announcement that they made about Google's co-locating data science teams in Rochester, Minnesota, helping to buttress Mayo's already formidable data science team and capabilities, and bringing to bear some of the assets that Google has around AI and the DeepMind unit that they have in London that they've now brought over to the US is certainly an example of that. These are capabilities that take a lot of money to develop, right? I mean, the talent war for AI talent is massive, right? It costs a lot of money, multi-millions of dollars in some cases for the best AI talent. So if you're if you're a startup, let's take Echo, for example, that has also a partnership with Mayo. You could leverage that platform, that notion that a Google Mayo Echo team could do something really incredible together. And that you don't have to necessarily be a large medtech company to take advantage of that type of capability. You just have to be able to knock on some doors and start those types of conversations, and realize that while your algorithms might be good, they could certainly be enhanced by this access to this much broader capability set that these companies bring.
We have a couple questions from the crowd. Again, if you have a question, please post it in the Q&A or in the chat. We'll monitor both. So if you have a question, just let us know. One of the questions is, with the growth of telemedicine, how do you see that impacting reimbursements from carriers to hospitals and doctors?
Yeah, I mean, you're already starting to see reimbursement rules be much more user-friendly for telehealth consults and consultations. I mean, they are in some cases still less than the in-person visit, right? But you're starting to see some wiggle room there from the regulatory side in terms of really creating the enhancements and the reimbursement guidelines for those types of visits, the telehealth, the virtual visits, to be reimbursed at a similar rate, or even in some cases the same rate. I think, our point of view is that trend's only going to develop. I mean, obviously the regulatory bodies really want to make sure that this continues and this happens, and they don't want people not getting the access to care that they need, right? And so what are some ways to do that? You make it feasible for companies to pull that off and to create the infrastructure, the underlying infrastructure to create, to have access to those conversations. So, I mean, we see that trend being a positive trend. And I think it depends, again, on how productive the productivity and the cost containment, because you could go, this could go many which ways. You could have a really expensive version of that consult, or you could have the good enough version that gets you connected into the patient that then leads to other, needs, healthcare needs downstream. So.
Okay. Next question is from Sean O'Brien, and his question is, with more data, value-based contracting can be achieved, and he wants to know what your experience is with payers, providers' willingness to share data to make value-based contracting a reality. Right.
Yeah, I mean, this value-based healthcare and contracting has been with us again as a trend that's been there for a while now, a number of years. I think companies are trying out different things, right? So if you see what Philips is doing with 9 health systems, starting with Jackson Health, they started in 2018. And they are taking over a lot of the hardware and software needs of that health system of Jackson Health, and 9 other systems, Bon Secours, Banner Health, that they've signed contracts with. And what they're doing is they're taking the cost of the hardware and software off the P&L of the providers, and they're saying to the providers, pay us on a per patient, per use basis for the use of those devices, and not just the Philips devices, any of the devices the healthcare system uses, but that is jointly managed with Philips. And we will create the insight engine behind which we will better understand how those patients flow through your health system, right? And they're 11-year contracts, so they're long-term bets. They're very aggressive, and they point to this notion that Philips, is now really becoming it's not just a med device company, it's also a software company, right? And they spend 60% of their R&D budget on software. And that's a traditional medtech company that's sort of, and rightly proud of a lot of the medtech devices. They're seeing software as a major investment area and a major focus area. And so what are they going to do? They're going to learn from all the other assets they bought along the way, the population health assets they bought. They're going to start to do some population health assessments of the patients flowing through those health systems, and they're going to manage those patients in different ways through different segments. And then they're likely to use those to go at risk with the providers on the management, on maybe with the payers, on the management of those patients, because they're going to learn so much, right? They're going to have a holistic view of those patients. They have devices where, at home as well, as you know, Philips has a number of those devices. So they're going to just follow those patients through these systems and go at risk in some cases. But they need to collect a body of data. They need to coalesce it, curate it, analyze it, to then be really good and at the predictive element that then is underpinning the contracts, right?
Right. Another related question from Frederick Jones: are payers willing to pay for monthly data subscriptions and monitoring when they're used to paying one-time fee at the time of implant?
This is the business model question. I think jury's still out, right? I mean, these are business model questions that are being tested in the marketplace at this point, and nobody knows necessarily right now what's going to stick. It's also the case that these platforms are only now getting built up, right? I mean, they're nascent. It takes a bit of time to generate the big data sets and to train the algorithms and to improve them beyond the narrow use cases that we've been seeing up to now. So, I mean, I think, once we start seeing evidence that these platforms are delivering better insights, better clinical insights, then you'll start to see a migration to really being able to charge those types of monthly rates. But I mean, right now I think everybody's on a race to try to prove that their platform is the best, right? And that's going to, again, depend on the big data sets, the data science teams, and the last mile, right? We often forget, like, you could have the best infrastructure, data science teams, the best algorithms. If you don't change the patient and physician behavior on the last mile, then it really didn't amount to much. So, we often advise our clients to pair up their data science teams with the behavioral scientists to try to make sense of how this gets inserted into the clinical workflow, how the insights get used, what the follow through is, and that's somewhere where payers and others are fairly well entrenched, and where they can be partners for medtech companies and consumer technology companies.
Right. Okay. And one last question, and our segment time will be up. 9 months ago, Congress had a focus on targeting biopharma medtech as a cause of the healthcare costs with regulation and price controls, but were diverted by COVID. And now the industry is the hero. When do you see Congress redirecting focus back to industry? End of the year, beginning of next year, is it off the table entirely?
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think, as was clearly or is clearly being demonstrated by COVID, where do people turn for hope, right? I mean, where is that? What are the types of companies and capabilities they're going to need it to get us out of this pandemic? And oftentimes they reside in the pharmaceutical and medical technology companies that are at the heart of some of these solutions, whether it be the testing, the diagnostic tests, whether it be the vaccine development. I mean, these are real solutions that are going to bring real value to society, right? And we've seen the economic effects of what this has done to us, right? I think the reframing of the conversation about the value that these companies make, I think, is going to be pretty profound. But companies are still going to be required to bring to market products that are going to create solutions, right? And they're going to create better clinical outcomes. That's not going to stop. And better productivity, right? I mean, we often forget that the AI, and I've certainly had a lot of my provider clients tell me that the most useful AI is really right now is for clinical workflow productivity issue, scheduling, things like that necessarily don't have to do necessarily straight to the patient, but that are just the operations of a hospital system, around the operations of a hospital system. So the efficiencies that are going to be needed to be generated from medtech companies and pharma companies are still going to be, have to be, required and expected by society. So.
Great. I think that's our time. So, Dean, I guess back to you.
Thank you, Pedro, Rich. Really appreciate the dialogue, the insights. As a reminder to all participating today, we are going to share these slides. This is a recorded session, so you get the full recording, you'll get the slides, and you'll also get the link to Deloitte's report that Pedro referenced in his remarks and the Q&A. We've got a second half of this session starting right now, led by Michael Harrington, partner with Fox Rothschild. We're going to get into a little discussion on the MedTech funding outlook. Michael, one of the leaders of their emerging growth practice at Fox Rothschild, and also a longtime PACT board member. Michael, the floor is yours. Just, you got to unmute.
I am unmuted. I thought you'd unmute me. Good morning, everybody. Let me first start off by thanking everybody who is in the webinar here, both our participants, our panel participants, but those of you who are logged in. I know that this is a new norm, and I'm really thrilled that we've got 60 or 70 or so folks that are interested in this topic and are taking advantage of this new format. Thanks as well to PACT for doing what I think is a really bang up job of handling this new norm and putting on some great content for us at a real crucial time. And then also I'll just extend to everybody from PACT, on behalf of PACT, on behalf of Fox, my firm, I hope everybody's healthy and everybody's staying safe during this crazy time. I do hold out the hope that we're getting through it and we're gonna open up and get a little bit more back to norm in the next couple weeks. But that's kind of a theme here, is the norm that we're gonna get back to is a new norm. And we're gonna talk about that from a funding side of things. Let me set up our panel correctly, then I'll introduce both of my panel participants. As you well know, looking at the roster of folks that are in this webinar here, are logged into us, you're very familiar with the type of company that we're talking about here. These are very unique companies, medtech companies. They go through rapid life cycles in compressed time periods, 5 to 10 years, usually. And a key component of these companies is that they really are dependent on a healthy venture capital financing marketplace and participants because of the need for extreme amounts of capital in a very compressed period. That's the market that funds these companies. So that's our focus today, is how are we doing in that regard? What's the current state of affairs and what's the outlook? And we're going to pick 3 important topics in that discussion: both financing and investment focus, the financing process, and then deal flow. And we'll touch upon exits and exit scenarios in that process. So in doing that, we have 2 terrific participants on the panel today. Anthony Williams is a partner with HealthQuest Capital, and Jason Smith is a director of life sciences with IP Group. Both HealthQuest and IP Group are very active regional investors, but they're also national and even international in scope. So great to have Anthony and Jason with us today. I've given them very few rules in terms of what they need to do other than to use complete sentences and impress us with a big word here or there. So I'll take through as a moderator, just kind of take us through, but I really throw it open to Anthony and Jason to impart upon us what's going on. And then also I encourage questions, please. We've got a good function here. It looks like use the Q&A function on Zoom, get the questions in, and to the extent you have them, we'll make sure that we get them worked in here. So let me just start off, Anthony, with you with a quick introduction. Anything you want to tell us about you and HealthQuest that would be important to this?
Yeah, probably just a second, just to sort of frame the difference between potentially my answers and Jason's. So HealthQuest is a healthcare focused growth equity fund. So we invest across the spectrum of healthcare, but are investing at the commercial stage. So the companies we invest in, their technologies or offerings are through FDA if that's required, and are either or at least commercial ready, and in most cases have begun commercialization.
Terrific. Jason, a quick introduction from you as well.
Sure. Yeah, just to follow on Anthony's comments. So IP Group is a very early stage investor. We consider ourselves a foundational investor working with seed and pre-seed companies, and that's across the entire spectrum of technology, everything from kind of software and materials all the way through biotech. So obviously be talking specifically about the med tech portion today, but think of everything coming through IP Group as that earlier stage of the pipeline, mostly pre-commercial. So kind of on the opposite side from Anthony.
All right, terrific. So Anthony, let's start with you. And what I want to ask is just kind of general thoughts on the state of venture capital financing as it relates to med tech, and contrast if you could. So I would say most of us are 11 weeks and a couple days into this shutdown. So 12 weeks ago or 13 weeks ago versus today, what's the contrast between who we were and what we are today?
Yeah, is everybody probably on this webcast is aware, the differences are significant, right? It's demonstrably more negative funding environment for medtech now versus sort of middle of Q1 or really until the middle of March. It's interesting though. It's not an ideal time to raise capital. As a medtech company, but companies are still getting funded. And at decent valuations for the most part. As often happens during periods of economic uncertainty, though, there are fewer funds, maybe Jason's notwithstanding, willing to place bets on early stage medtech. My suspicion is, based on just sort of anecdotal data we get on deals getting done, that there's been a shift to commercial and even later stage commercial assets versus sort of pre-revenue development stage. But I think, if you asked me at the end of March, I would have told you that, the window was going to be closed for capital. That's not true, but it probably takes a stronger company to get funded than was true 12 or 15 weeks ago.
Jason, how about take that from an early stage perspective?
Yeah, at the earlier stage, so far this has really been more of an operational disturbance than a capital disturbance. We'll talk a little bit later about some movement in the market. Anthony mentioned funds potentially moving later. We are seeing a lot of our companies that are pressing towards value inflections that are related to studies or work at CROs. A lot of that is slowing down. Deals are still getting done. So we've done a couple of deals and seen some move along. It's as is usually the case with it when some softness comes into the market. The strong deals aren't having too much trouble, but the ones that were kind of borderline getting closed, those are the ones that are having a bit of an issue. But I think at the moment we're still, as I said, in more of an operational disturbance. It hasn't quite become a deep financial disturbance, which is, I think, what we're all kind of questioning whether or not will happen long term. But at this point, I think funds are generally healthy, except with maybe the exception of the corporate VC side. So those guys are definitely slowing down as they're reporting earnings and having to kind of justify things to their shareholders.
Anthony, to your back to your point on deals are getting done. It's the better company. VCs are changing perspectives a little bit. Are they more focused or necessarily more focused on current portfolio companies and having to make sure that they are doing something different with those or preserving capital for those? Or is it more just uncertainty about this new norm, so it's affecting new opportunities?
Well, to be honest, I think it's both, right? At the end of March, or a little bit earlier than that, pretty much all of us, turned introspective and looked at our existing portfolio companies. And certainly as we got to the end of March, beginning of April, started talking with every one of them about cash conservation plans and shifting their business models around and eliminating unnecessary expenses and finding a way, to the extent that they weren't on a path to cash flow break even, to extend that runway as long as possible. And I'm not aware of anybody in the industry that didn't do that. For most funds, though, that raised capital in the last few years should still be in a position where they've got adequate capital reserve for the existing portfolio, and hopefully still have additional capital to put to work. And at the end of the day, that's what we get paid to do. So I still think that there are opportunities for new deals to get done, even though most of us are trying to manage the existing portfolio maybe more closely or more judiciously than we did before.
Jason, is there more pressure at Anthony's point there? Is there more pressure at an earlier in an earlier stage portfolio because of how much further your companies might be from revenue, more deeper into a regulatory cycle, approval cycle? Is it a more difficult balance with a fund like yours?
It's interesting. You can cut it both ways. I would say, in one sense, since a lot of our companies, most of our companies aren't in revenue generation, slowdowns in the market on the revenue side don't really affect us that much, right? Because we weren't expecting capital coming into these companies at this point. Now, operationally, it does push out those value inflecting milestones, right? Whether it's, product launches or, studies at our institutions. I think, one thing that's been interesting to me, I think, in the Philadelphia area, we're all really blessed with a lot of high-powered academic research institutions where we're used to being able to do a lot of this work, relatively easily. But the definition of elective procedures has really changed in the current environment. It used to be maybe your vision correction and cosmetic things, but now it's basically anything that there won't be harm if you wait a little while. And I think especially in the medtech space, that really puts a lot of things, pushes us out from a timeline perspective. So it does put you in a position of having to think about, your runway, costs that are kind of that baseline operating expense, those will drag out. And this is where, a lot of our companies, it's good to have a solid base of long-term investors behind you that are willing to help you get across that gap. I think, bridge financings are difficult to go out in the market and get. If you can do something like that internally, I think it's the best way to maintain value within the company while we kind of figure out how long this period of uncertainty is going to last.
Yeah, good. All good thoughts. Let's turn to investment focus, because I think that's a really important topic to understand, to see if there are changes. So the companies that are out there that are looking for financing that may have approached you in the past because you were a strong medtech investor that was in orthopedics, for example. Boy, are you now a medtech investor that's in the anti-infective space because of COVID. So let's talk about investment, financing and investment focus. So Anthony, to you, has your investment focus or areas now changed in light of COVID and the pandemic?
So I wouldn't say our focus has changed. As I mentioned at the beginning, so we invest across the spectrum of healthcare. So devices, diagnostics, research tools, healthcare IT, services. It basically, if it has the opportunity to optimize the delivery of healthcare, it's on spec for us. And that's not going to change. Although I will say that, while we're not chasing COVID specific solutions, some of the offerings that do have to provide additional benefit in the current environment were attractive to us before, or arguably more attractive to us now. We've talked about not necessarily anti-infectives or things like that so much, because it's hard to know which one's going to win in that space. But we've obviously we're all aware of sort of different offerings, different solutions that can deliver healthcare in a safer way. So Pedro mentioned telehealth in his prepared remarks. That's one example. Virtual clinical trials, robotics, and other offerings that can increase the distance between a caregiver and a patient. And technologies that can enable office-based procedures and get procedures out of the hospital and the ASC and into the physician's office. So not COVID-specific solutions, but definitely solutions that have the opportunity to aid in the ultimate recovery from the pandemic.
Interesting. Jason, how about from your fund's perspective? Are you changing focus in any regard?
We haven't changed our focus. I think, as Anthony mentioned, I think we are seeing things with a bit of a COVID slant to them. And I think, that's driven, by the market, by people, wanting to have an impact here, and also by some of the non-dilutive funding opportunities. So there's just really a flood of that coming in right now. So if you can point your, home diagnostic platform at, looking at COVID antibodies or things like that, your video platform at something related to telehealth. I think we again focus on the core of the innovation. So, but there are some things that are getting interesting, specifically in the kind of anti-infective delivery space. For example, technologies that are enabling for mRNA vaccines or things like that. So we're taking a good look at those. But I think at the moment, some of the fundamental elements, more on the biotech side of things, that have made anti-infective investments difficult, I think are still there. But we're definitely watching that change in the market.
And Jason, how about for IP Group? I know one of your important aspects of your deal flow and your funnel are the academic institutions.
Right.
And they have largely shut down, like the rest of us, for such an extended period. How's that affected you?
Yeah, that's the kind of the top of our funnel, right? So that's where we're at the institutions, having those interactions with faculty and the labs. So that has slowed down, no doubt about it. Our ability to get in there and have those face-to-face interactions, build those relationships, and do some of those initial explorations of the strength of the technologies and how we're going to kind of build a plan to take those forward. So have been happy to see some things starting to open up, labs allowing, 1 or 2 people in staggered shifts. So we're excited to see that open back up. But yeah, the very top of our funnel has slowed down. But once we've generated some of those relationships and started moving things into our process, we've had a couple of deals close once we were doing everything, but it was just virtual.
Good. So that's a good segue then into the financing process. Let me have you guys focus on what does closing a deal look like in this time? Has it changed? What's a virtual diligence like? Regionally here, we had one of our strong regional investors, Osage, that had a great story a week or two about closing a deal completely done during this shutdown, all virtually, et cetera. And that's great. I really was appreciating that approach is viable for companies, because that's a lot of the angst that I see with my companies and the others out there of how do we do this? And one in particular wanting to close a deal and the investor having to see them personally before we could move to a closing. So how do you make that happen when governments don't allow that? So focus then on your financing process. One or both of you mentioned that you have closed deals during the shutdown. So Anthony, first, what's changed in the process? What should companies know?
Yeah, well, obviously we're all virtual now under sort of current circumstances. We were, at HealthQuest, we were pretty virtual before, and that's just sort of the nature of our makeup. We are geographically distributed. And so we've always operated virtually. So we were, Zoom was a daily occurrence for us, or has been, for a long time, certainly long before the coronavirus. And so lots of Zoom, lots of telephone calls, channel checks and customer calls and things like that. Those were largely done, by, virtually before. Diligence too, for, just sort of document review and the like. I think the hardest part is the one you mentioned is, sort of management evaluation is a real challenge to do remotely. You can call, recruiters can call and do background checks and things like that, but you learn a lot about people, both their personalities, how they interact with each other by spending what I'll call excess time with them, not just the hour meeting, but going for an hour meeting, having lunch, meeting sort of other members of the team while the management is still there, and that's hard to replicate virtually. We have closed a couple of deals since the pandemic hit the US. One was baked before but the middle of March, and we just hadn't funded it yet. But we did source a deal, source diligence and close sort of post mid-March. But that part was hard. That management interaction is the hardest part for us to retool effectively.
And I'd have to say it then changes the investment paradigm that always, in my experience now for a lot of years with you folks, is it starts with the people, right? You're investing first in that aspect of it. And is that true? Does it really, is that less emphasized, or it's just you need to find a way to do that differently now?
Oh, it's definitely not less emphasized. It is still essential, and we're just finding different ways to get the answers.
Good. Jason, how about you from process procedure here for your financings?
Yeah, I'll echo a lot of Anthony's comments. I think, as I said before, with us being early stage, engaging with the institutions, going into the labs, with all that shut down, it's been difficult to get anything started at the top of the funnel. So we haven't done anything new since since that mid-March timeframe. But a couple of things that finished were already in the funnel. But we have been evolving to more of this virtual platform as well. I'll say that you learn different things about people a lot of the time, right? You don't have the ability to have the coffee, have the lunch. But more people know my dog now than ever knew my dog before. So I think we are finding different ways. I think if this extends, that I think our partner institutions, the universities, will really be transitioning their operations as well. So I think that'll be a continuous learning process.
Good. Great question from the audience here that would be appropriate for this. And it's a question on, what are you seeing in terms of valuations? Are you seeing discounts? Are you seeing deal terms? Let's broaden it more than just valuations, but deal terms. Are you seeing dramatic shifts in that, or is it stay the course, hasn't really impacted it greatly yet? Anthony, how about you?
I think, it's still early days, right? Not a ton of deals are getting done. So I'm not sure that I would extrapolate data just yet, but I will say, for the most part, I think we're seeing valuations that are sliding down, but not in a meaningful way. We may see deals, especially deals that sort of follow on from a deal a year ago, and maybe those valuations are flat, as opposed to maybe something that would have 3 months ago, where you would have expected some sort of uptick. Certainly on the medtech side, I think the answer is a little bit different in the digital health side, just because that space is so hot right now. And and I guess the other thing is, I'm not sure how long it'll last. Inari went out last week with and upsized the range of their IPO and doubled right straight away. So I'm not sure that the valuations are meaningfully different, and I'm equally unsure how long that's going to last.
Jason, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I share the thoughts again. I think we don't have enough data here as far as deals. I think I've definitely heard anecdotal stories of a COVID discount, a little bit of a drop in valuations, and also some, interestingly, offers of more capital, right? So for a lot of our early stage companies, we're trying to take enough capital to get to the next financing milestone. And if it is an exciting deal, definitely having offers of a little more capital to get through a prolonged period of uncertainty. But I think it's still shaking out for sure.
Good. That's actually a good segue into a next topic of really talking about exits and what are you doing now? How are you evaluating both current opportunities and portfolio companies that you've already been invested in terms of their exits, valuations, their exit possibilities? Are you handicapping exits differently? How about that? Turning to you, Jason. What has this done to how you look at the long-term prospect and the exit potential for a company?
So this is an interesting one for us because, again, being a very early stage fund, if you look back at previous downturns, a lot of times the the things that end up being your biggest winners were the ones that kind of got started when things were a bit slow, right? So a lot of our opportunities are far enough from exit that we're not handicapping things too much. A couple of our more advanced companies, we're starting to think about either, a slight drop in M&A activity, or maybe a year delay on, kind of hitting that revenue point where you'd want to do an exit. But that's more the things that are looking at an exit in a kind of 2 to 3 year window.
Anthony, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't know. I think in the later stage stuff, the answer is not dissimilar to what Jason just said. For the companies that are in the portfolio now and were planning or at least strategizing towards an exit, this year is not likely to be their year. Again, sort of an already withstanding or notwithstanding, the IPO market for medtech is at best going to be challenging probably for the rest of the year. I mean, if you're cash flow break even and growing at 700% annual revenue, you can probably do whatever you want. But the companies don't fit that profile. So I think the companies that were looking near term are going to be delayed, both on the IPO side and likely on the M&A side, unless they truly fit a strategic need that doesn't exist at a buyer. In terms of companies that we're looking at, so we're multi-year holders, not quite as long probably as Jason and IP Group, but we generally hold assets for 3, 4, 5 years, sometimes longer. So as we look at it, we're thinking there's likely a revenue ramp delay that might impact due to 2020 and an impact on the market. So it might require us to hold a little bit longer for the company to hit their revenue targets where they think that they got that inflection point and are attractive to be acquired. But we're still handicapped with that, probably 3 or 4 quarters at most, at least right now. And it might be more, it might be less, but when you're talking about 2024 and 2025, it's kind of hard to evaluate with any more precision than that.
Yeah, when they actually perfect the crystal ball, we'll be able to do those sorts of things.
That's right.
In our waning 2 minutes here, let's answer one final question from the audience, and then we'll do a quick wrap up. So the question is a good one for the two of you as part of the wrap up. Question being our funding sources. So you folks, VCs, are you more, less, or the same in terms of your accessibility? And is this a better opportunity now to begin networking into your organizations when things open up? So what do you tell companies in that regard?
I'm happy to go first. So I think what I will say for HealthQuest, for sure, we are undoubtedly more accessible. So a couple of reasons for that. One is, we went into this quarter deciding that we were going to be active. There's sort of 2 approaches, right? You can just sort of hunker down and get through Q2 and maybe Q3 and then see what happens. Or you can decide that this is, there are a lot of opportunities here. And we chose the latter approach. So we are actively evaluating deals and that requires deal flow. And which means we want to talk to entrepreneurs and see learn more about what they're doing. The other is, as a practical matter, none of us is traveling, right? I mean, so we're not doing the things that were just innately calendar inefficient, right? So I have, even with the same amount of work, I have a lot more time in my day because I'm just walking down the hall and I'm sitting down at my desk, but there's no time that isn't that. And so I think it's a right time. Even the funds that have decided that they don't want to invest just now, they're certainly probably have more availability to begin or continue a conversation or reach back out, depending on sort of the nature of the relationship. Even if it's not for something right now, but to sort of make sure that the relationship stays warm, they're aware of the story. And when things improve, if that's their approach, that they could be a funding partner then.
Good. Jason, we'll give you the final word, then turn it back to Dean.
Sure. Yeah, I had a lot of similar thoughts to Anthony, right? Less time on planes, trains, and automobiles means I'm much more accessible. I will say that nobody has quite perfected the Zoom networking happy hour yet. So I think you have to, use personal connections and reach out and make some investor contacts. But I think the opportunities are there. And actually, one point I didn't want to make really quickly, I think it's important for everybody in the context of the current situation to not only be thinking about getting through it, but thinking about how you're going to accelerate on the back end of this, right? Because I think, there's a big operational disturbance here. Making it through is key, but then, all the CROs are going to be backed up. The market, you're going to need to hit the market running. So I think we're really pressing our companies to both, plan for them making it through this, but then also be in the lead coming out on the back end.
Listen, those are great final words. And I thank Jason and Anthony tremendously, both on behalf of PACT, on behalf of my firm as a good sponsor here, and really appreciate the insights. To the audience, I hope this is helpful. I think there's one or two key takeaways. Probably one, it is a new norm and it's a different norm, and figure it out. And the other is, I think there's a little bit of optimism, even though we didn't hit that in a lot of respects. But I think Jason's final point's a good one. Going forward, there is opportunity here. There is some paradigm shift. The fundamentals aren't going to change. There are good venture firms. They're still investing in companies, and we need to find ways of getting them interested in our good companies, particularly here regionally. So Dean, back to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael, Anthony, Jason, to all of our panelists, to all of our sponsors. Again, Duane Morris and Rich Cohen and Sandra Stoneman, to EisnerAmper, to Penn Center for Innovation, RSM, and Michael, your firm, Fox Rothschild. We've got some terrific upcoming content, and to Jason's point, we think we have nailed the format for some interaction between investors and entrepreneurs. You'll see that coming up here in the not too distant future, but here's a couple of the programs that we have coming up. Please fill out the survey. You will get a copy of this broadcast, as well as, again, the Deloitte report that was shared earlier in this program. Thank you all. Stay safe. Have a terrific day.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.